Sometimes it takes a 3-year-old to jolt you out of your received certainties. That was my experience one winter morning several years ago. Back then, I was an infantry soldier in the Israeli army, doing a morning patrol in the old city of Nablus. I'd grown up in a Jewish community in Norway, and I joined the Israeli army as a fresh-faced recruit. However, I don't think anything could have prepared me for the complexity of the situation I encountered once I finished basic training. One thing is fighting a militant organization on Israel's northern border, but it's quite another to be plunked down in the middle of a civilian population. And so I found myself walking down the cobblestone streets of Old Nablus. And then all of a sudden this girl appeared. She walked out of her house, it was early in the morning, and we were standing facing each other. A 3-year-old girl and a 20-year-old soldier. I was dressed up in full battle regalia with a helmet and bulletproof vest and a big machine gun. And she, looking at me, completely froze from fear. And I remember that feeling of wanting to tell her that she had nothing to worry about, that she was safe, and realizing there was no way I could actually communicate that. I was trapped in a cage, partly of my own making. And what I wanted to tell her was, I'm more than this, but there was no way I could. She ran back into the house, but that feeling stayed with me to this day. I was mindful of this story several years later when I met Janine Carroll, a New Zealander working and living in London. She had been one of the pioneers in the field of restorative justice back in New Zealand. And what she had created there was a program where she brought young offenders together with victims of various crimes. And one of her stories I wanted to share with you. A young boy had smashed the car windows of about 30 cars, and Janine had brought the boy together with some of the car owners. Initially, the tension in the room was palpable. The car owners were outraged. They wanted to know why he had done it. The boy, shifting in his chair in front of the audience, said, "Well, I don't know, I guess I was bored." That set off another round of indignant shouts among the car owners, and then each of them began to tell their story. One man had a special car fitted because of his mobility problems, and since the crime hadn't been able to get around. A woman had a young daughter who had started to wet the bed at night because she was afraid that the bad man might come and smash the windows of the house too. As each of the victims told their stories, the boy sank further and further into himself, his face flushed. When one of them asked him, "Well, why did you do it?" The boy answered, "Well, I didn't know they were your cars." One of the victims asked the boy what he was doing with his life anyway. And the boy said, well, he wasn't doing too well at school. It hadn't helped that he'd been chucked out of home the previous year, but that he had been thinking of perhaps becoming a car mechanic. And that was just enough for one of the victims to say, well, if that's what you want to do, why don't you ask for help? I've got a garage where we train young people just like you. Slowly, without even noticing, the boy and the crowd were able to move beyond labels. An agreement was drawn up for mutual commitments and a way forward. And then, as the meeting came to a close, the tension still running high, the crowd descended down the aisle and converged on the boy. The boy was frightened at this crowd coming at him, and then they wrapped their arms around him and just held him. Both had realized that their labels as victims and perpetrators were not permanent, but instead something they could overcome together. Each of them were able to say, I'm more than this. Restorative justice is an approach to human behavior that seeks to recognize that there is more to each of us than what we are when we're at our lowest. Conventional prisons are built on a model not of restoration, but of retribution. However, what has happened in the last 20 years is a sharp rise in the number of prisoners all around the world. In the UK, there's been a doubling of numbers, and in the US, a quadrupling of numbers from 500,000 to over 2 million prisoners. And it is taken for granted that this system of incarceration not only is necessary, but that the system is efficient. However, in case you haven't noticed, it isn't working. Both countries, and that's true for other places around the world as well, the reoffending rates is around 70%. And in the UK last year, 90% of convicted prisoners were repeat offenders. That tells us something important about a system that has gone wrong. Now, the reoffending rates that have remained at that level in so many countries might have something to do with a system that says to the offender, you're not part of us anymore. And it's not so strange then that some offenders might conclude, well, if I'm not part of them, then their rules don't apply to me. Clearly there is a role for incarceration in many cases, but one wonders if there isn't also an element of revenge at work here, punishing the offender as exacting some kind of vengeance. Perhaps we should be mindful of Confucius, who said, before you embark on a journey of revenge, dig 2 graves. Because that is exactly the irony of our current prison system. It harms both the perpetrator, who is more likely to reoffend and be reconvicted, and society that continues to remain unsafe. So, can science help us chart a way forward here? Well, we know from work in psychology that much of emotion, much of what is previously been a preserve of theology, much of morality is actually grounded in our emotions. And we know from work in neurobiology that there are specific areas of the brain that are involved in processing moral emotions such as empathy. My own research has been on this part of the brain called the amygdala, which is thought to be a key part of the brain circuit that underlies empathy. And that is the trigger in restorative justice for that cascade of moral emotions, guilt and shame and embarrassment, that the meeting between the victim and the perpetrator is able to achieve. How does this work at the level of the brain? Well, it's very difficult to study the neurocircuitry of the amygdala in humans, at least in live humans, and so we studied the neurobiology of mice. Our mice were genetic knockouts, meaning that they had a receptor lacking in the amygdala specifically. They were what I call conditional knockouts, meaning that we were able to turn the receptor on and off. And what we found was striking. The absence of the receptor, specifically in the amygdala, was correlated with a lack of emotional behavior in the animal. And when the receptor was reinstated, the animal was able to recover their function. This suggests that the brain has radical potential for change, even in its most archaic parts. Now, there are good reasons, there are lots of reasons to say that this isn't the whole story. There are a field growing now called epigenetics that look at the gene-environment interactions, and especially gene-environment interactions in the brain. And what we know is that early negative life events, such as neglect and abuse, have the potential to disrupt the brain circuitry of the amygdala. But because we know the brain is capable of negative effects like that, we also know that the brain has the power to change. Our research into the neurobiology of the amygdala shows that the brain has the potential for radical change. And what I wanted to share with you is a really interesting way of applying this research to humans. This recent study, published just this year, brought a group of psychopaths. I work with psychopaths in Wormwood Scrubs prisons, and in this study they brought the psychopaths into the MRI scanner and showed them pictures of individuals undergoing different forms of distress, pain. When the image of the person was somebody they didn't know, the response in the amygdala was virtually 0 in the first column, but in the second column you see the response when the pain was imagined applied to themselves. So we know that psychopaths have a potential for empathy. It is just that they apply it differently. And that is a key insight into the neurobiology of empathy. It means that every person is born with a capacity to feel empathy. It is just that in many cases, that potential is not nurtured through safe attachment and secure social relations. Now, we all have moments when we feel that our love for humanity grows thin, or rather, like Charlie Brown says, that we might love humanity, it is just the people we can't stand. We all have moments like that, but the key insight of this research is that that can be overcome through encounters with real people, in real situations where you hear people's story. And that is exactly what restorative justice does. It allows individuals to become part of what Peter Singer, the philosopher, has called their moral circle, and that can be a powerful, transformative experience. Over 85% of victims who have participated in restorative justice processes say that they feel relieved by having gone through the process. And the most recent data from the UK Council of Restorative Justice suggests that it leads to a 30% reduction in reoffending. Nothing else that we do comes close to that. And that is why it is now urgent to roll this out into communities and schools so that we can use the power of restorative justice not only to heal after the damage has been done, but actually to to create a culture where empathy and caring becomes the norm. There are still those who consider the spectre of restorative justice unsettling and even. Let us allow ourselves to become attentive to that potential for empathy that we all have, and that restorative justice is able to return to us. Thank you.